Andrew, thank you for joining us here at Preaching Matters. I know you've been teaching 2 Samuel to some of our small groups this year, and that the notes will be available soon. You wanted to talk to us today about 2 Samuel 13 and teaching the emotion of a text. Help us get our theological bearings.
So chapter 13, a really horrible chapter in which Amnon rapes his sister and her brother murders Amnon in revenge. It's a horrific chapter, but it comes on the back of 2 chapters earlier, David's fall, when he commits adultery with Bathsheba and then has Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, killed in battle. And there is an obvious kind of thematic link between the two. So in chapter 11, David is guilty of sexual sin, and then on the back of that comes a murder at the hands of a third party. And similarly in chapter 13, there's a sexual sin of the most horrible, violent kind, this rape. And then following that, a murder by a third party. So there is this link between them. Bruce Waltke, in his commentary, in his Old Testament theology, entitles this section Chips Off the Old Block, because in David's family we see the likeness of what their father had done. But the link is even more direct, because in chapter 12 verse 10, when Nathan the prophet is pronouncing God's judgment against David, he says these words, chapter 12 verse 10, "Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife." So God decrees that the consequence for David's sin will be violence within his own household.
And what do you think the author's purpose is in including this chapter?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's here in the Bible to prove to us and make us really feel the fact that sin has terrible consequences. So if the Bible had just said sin has terrible consequences, full stop, that wouldn't have quite the weight that being shown the consequences has. And the Bible goes into some detail, and it's really quite horrible even to read it. I mean, we were studying it last night actually in our small groups, and it was difficult to have a discussion about it. It was difficult to be the person who read it out loud because it's so horrific. But I think it's there partly to say, look, the Bible lives in the real world. It's not just a rose-tinted, spring lambs frolicking over hillsides kind of picture of the world. It's a realistic picture of the world, and it's a no-holds-barred picture of what sin is like and what it does. And actually, I'm going to have to say, I don't think that the events of chapter 13 are without parallel, even in London. If you talk to some of the social workers, they would tell you that horrible things like this really do happen. One of the things, just as an aside, one of the things that irritates me about Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, is the part where he has a go at the Bible for describing horrible things. I think he uses Judges 19, and he says, look, the Bible must be immoral because it records immoral things, which is a ridiculous argument. It's like saying the Times newspaper is immoral because it details the horrible things that happen in Syria. I mean, no, it's just an honest, whether or not it's honest always, but it's honest about that, and that's horrible. So don't have a go at the Bible for being real about the horrible thing which is human depravity. But it goes into detail to show us and persuade us that sin is really horrific. And it does that by telling us about some real life and what happens in consequence to David's sin.
And so how do we teach the emotion in this passage?
Well, I think we just need to recognise that this text is doing more than just conveying theological content. Of course, the theological content is crucial. We must get that right. We must understand the meaning. But this is doing a lot more than the theological meaning. I mean, the theological meaning of this chapter is pretty straightforward. Sin has terrible consequences. But if we boil it down to those 4 words, sin has terrible consequences, and that's what we preach, then we've done less than the Holy Spirit has done. Because it didn't take him 4 words, it took him a whole chapter. And we've got to find a way of letting the weight of the chapter speak through our sermon or through our Bible study. And I think in this case, it does mean exploring the really horrible details. Now, this is going to be difficult to do, and it's going to be a difficult sermon to preach, just as it was a horrible Bible study to be in. In fact, even to read it is horrible. But that is the Holy Spirit's aim, that it will be a bit horrible. So that for us, sin has horrible consequences isn't just a concept, but it's something we begin to feel. And so you can just pick out many things here. That the fact that Amnon's rape is premeditated, The fact that the ruse he uses to get his sister is to feign to be ill and weak so that she shows compassion to him. And then it suddenly turns to violence where she's weak and he's strong. It's just a hideous kind of deception that his pretended vulnerability is his way to exploit her vulnerability. And just, this isn't adding theology, but it is helping us to see the horror of that point. And I think the other thing to say is I think we just want to be using the words themselves as much as we can of the passage, because the way in which the passage puts it, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is just more powerful than the way that we might rephrase it. Let me just read you a few verses and you can see just how horrible these are. Verse 15, chapter 13. Amnon hated her, his sister, with a very great hatred, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. Amnon said to her, "Get up, go." But she said to him, "No, my brother, for this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me." And even that is so tragic, isn't it? She can't even bring herself to specify what it was, the other thing you did. And of course, we know exactly what that was. But he would not listen to her. He called the young man who served him and said, "Put this woman," notice, not my sister, not Tamar, "this woman, put this woman out my presence, bolt the door after her." Now she was wearing a long robe with sleeves, for thus were the virgin daughters of the king dressed. Again, why this detail? Well, she's here in her beautiful princess dress. So his servant put her out, bolted the door after her, and Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the long robe that she wore, the virgin dress now in tatters. She laid her hand on her head, she went away, crying aloud as she went. I mean, it is horrible to read. It's a horrific thing. Rape is a horrible, horrible thing. But it's in the Bible, so that for us, the idea that sin has consequences isn't just a vague concept, but is a real life, ugly, real, horrible thing.
Andrew, thanks for joining us here at Preaching Matters.